in my big dream imagining, we get to distill the deepest stories and the truths that come out of community and out of history. When we have our voices heard and have our messages heard, we become leaders. Yetzap Oweliel, Siaya, Siem, Si Alaqua, Ich Imachna Etan, Antha Jada-Gabrielle Pape, Antha WuWas. Welcome to the Drawing Wisdom video podcast. We're in season 3. This is episode 2, where we complete our conversation with Michelle Good. Michelle, it's really, really nice. You know, when you were writing your book, when you were writing Five Little Indians, did you feel like you were writing it?
Good question. Sometimes I did, like sometimes it was an expression of my intention. But when I got into the zone, right, there's the magic zone of writing, it really felt like I was a scribe, right? That, as especially with certain characters, right? I was, I lived with them for 9 years, these characters. It took me 9 years to write that thing. And, and I'd be writing away, right, and I would hear one of them say, I wouldn't say that, right? Right? It's like, smarten up, Michelle, that's right. But, and yeah, a lot of the revision and a lot of the, backspacing and, starting over was feeling that I was hearing these stories, that I wasn't necessarily creating these stories, that I was hearing these stories, and, and that I had an obligation to what I was hearing. Lots of it is me, obviously, right? But, lots of it, I just firmly believe that there was so much influence from the other side in terms of this book, so much influence. And yeah, kind of like my life went upside down and fell apart, and the only thing I could do was this book. That's the only thing I was allowed to do. The only thing I was permitted to do was this book. And if that's not an indication, then I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know I texted you right after I finished reading your book, but I don't know that in full expression, or even if I have full expression for how transformational it was for me to visit and sit with each of the characters of the people who you brought forward in the book, or who offered themselves to you to tell the story. And I felt so, I just deeply loved each of them, but also that I was allowed to love them. That we so rarely see those books where we fall in love with our people, and where you revealed the many, many ripples, the ripple effect of what their experiences had been. And also I was shattered a great deal of the time reading the book. Like, I don't often have to put a book down and walk away, but I would close the book and I would put it down, and I just I need to step away because this is too much for me right now. But then I would miss them, and I'd want to come back and see how they're doing.
That's the magic of the book, right? That's the magic of the book.
Yeah.
And I can't take credit for that. That was something that was a gift to me that I gifted to the book. And, but you are not the only person that has said that. There has been such a phenomenal response to this book. And, overwhelmingly positive. All right. And the negative responses are very telling, right? And I actually value them because it gives me insight. Like the one I'm thinking about right now, uh, because it was fairly recent, was somebody said, it was a really great book. I really enjoy it. What a wonderful, blah, 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 all that positive stuff. And they said, except for the fact that the characters, okay, this was the words, the characters reek of education and refinement, which of course they don't. Right? I mean, the writing itself, okay, like the narration between the moments when the characters are speaking and engaging and so on, that may reek of my education and refinement, but the characters themselves don't. um and then that was sort of my first thought about it, and then I thought, wait a minute, my characters are insightful. Okay. um when they speak about like when Kenny is saying to Lucy, or maybe I can't remember just off the moment, but they're saying, I didn't survive, do you feel you survived? you know and basically the thing is, am I the person that walked in? Is that the same person that walked out? And I realized that what this person was saying is that my Indians weren't stupid enough.
Yeah.
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 and and I think that if I had the opportunity to speak to that person, and I told her that's what she was saying, she would be mortified. She would be horrified and say, no, 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 I'm not. And I would say, yes, 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 you are. And
Mm-hmm.
but that is the upside of sort of reviews like that, where people make comments like that, is it gives me the opportunity to talk about them to you, and and it pinpoints again the challenges of perception and misperception that we face, just trying to live in the world, right? And people seeing us in such a um, inaccurate way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's another thing that your book did, and which is totally preposterous, and is, says way more about me than about anybody else. But I felt really seen in reading your book, and what I mean by that is, through a great deal of my own trauma, and some of it being intergenerational and inherited from my family, I felt like the beautiful moments and the beautiful insights and the gentleness that all of your characters had, I felt like I can still have all of my beautiful moments and my gentleness, and I am not just a big ball of traumatic mess, that I am this whole big person. And so seeing that and the interactions of that, and even the pain and the messiness, helped me feel very seen. And I just, there's a couple of books in my life that I've read that I like to pack around the physical book afterwards,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
then I feel like I'm still, I
In
don't
it.
know, in it somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
in
I know.
it.
Yeah, in it. Yeah.
And that was one of those.
One of the things and one of the reasons that it took so long to write was um, to ensure that the characters were not cardboard cutouts, right? That they had that multi-layer of being a mess and being injured and being irreparable in some ways, but also being funny and deeply loving and loyal and, you know, ready to go if the need was there. And I mean, people want to say, oh, multidimensional characters, but that's not really what I'm getting at. Um, what I'm getting at is character representations that are truthful of what we have had to be as people who have been institutionally subjected to trauma, institutionally and systemically subjected to trauma. And by systemically, I mean by law. Things like the outlawing of the potlatch and the Sundance, and all of those things that became the law of the land, that were fundamentally traumatizing to us. And that we are all those things, but here we are, right? No matter The most powerful empires on the earth, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, sought to destroy Indigenous people, and here we are, right? And it's, sometimes I just think you guys should just pay attention, right? Like, the Roman Empire fell. All of these, ancient empires fell and were destroyed. Not us. I mean, we were around during the time of the Roman Empire and all that jazz, and we're still here. And we're still here, injured and compromised and modified and all of those things, but the heart and soul of us is still here. And if people paid attention, they might learn something phenomenal, right? But, and I have a book of essays coming out in the end of May, and I love it because it gave me an opportunity to rant about, all of these kinds of things. But, one of the things that I am dedicated to is getting underneath the myth of Canadian history, right? To get underneath it and to put it in the mirror for people, right? Say, so you were told this, meanwhile, it was actually this, right? And, to give people the, something substantial that will aid them in reconsidering what they think they know. And, which is something that Five Little Indians did for so many people. You would be amazed at the number of people that have reached out to me, and if I had to sort of make them all the same comment, it would be, I just didn't know this was happening, but now I'll never forget. And driving people towards their own journey of self-education or re-education about the reality of Indigenous people in Canada. And so that's what I wrote these essays for, right? Is to say, well, take a look at this. Tell me what you think. Right? So, but they're very conversational. They're not academic essays. And so I hope that people will avail themselves.
What I hear in it is actually you're growing a forest. You're growing all these trees. So your essays are planting seeds so people can go and grow.
I've got all these seedlings. Come and get my seedlings and just carry on. Yeah. And I feel, I don't know if you hear this in your life, but I hear it all the time when people are talking about, reconciliation and, what can we do? And, my overarching response is take responsibility for your own education, but intensely, right? Like, don't ask me, what you need to do. Okay, you've listened to something that I've had to say, and it's moved you to question. So just carry on your own little quest of questioning. There's lots of resources out there now, right? But I think it's really important to insist that people be responsible for their own education. That, because if they're not, then they can just say, well, nobody will tell me about it. Nobody will teach me about it, and just abandon, any kind of endeavor to truly understand and to truly make change, because somebody else didn't spoon feed them, what they need to know. So, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think as one of the actions of truth and reconciliation, that's one piece. And I think the ongoingness, the ongoing nature of people taking initiative on their own education, right? To not feel like now I've got it, right?
Right.
And to recognize that it's an ongoing.
Well, and it is, right? Because everything is in a state of flux. That is the first law of the universe, is that everything is changing constantly. Nothing is the same this second to that second. And, we run into trouble when we try to anchor ourselves in a moment, whether that moment is an era, a thought, or an ideology, or, when we try to anchor ourselves in something, then we drown. Right? Yeah, and we stop growing, we remain stuck, and we stop learning, and yeah, we become less fluid than we should be. Yeah.
Even the tree, when it stops growing and it falls down, it still contributes to all of the life around it,
Yes.
right?
Well, that's right.
It
I
remains
love
an
those.
important part of.
Oh, two of my favorite things about trees, right? One is nursery trees, right? Where you see the trees that have fallen in the forest and there are trees that are growing out of them. Like you still see, the trunk of the tree, or the trunk of the tree, but it's fallen, but then all these seedlings are coming out of it, right? And the other one is when trees take over. I've got a couple of photographs I've taken that I just go, oh, I love it. And it's like this, one of them is on the way to Batoche, and there's a car, it looks like it's about maybe 1940s or 1950s. It's just an old wreck, right? And there's this beautiful tree that has grown up through this car, right? And it's just, there's the skeleton of the car, and there's this gorgeous tree, like just so alive and vibrant, and I love it. There was another one that I really like. I have a photograph somewhere of it, and it's a stop sign, and this, how the stop signs, you have the sign, and then there's the post, and the post is open, right? It's like, I don't know how to describe it, but there was a sapling growing up through the post of the stop sign, right? And I watched it over a period of years, and it's all greenery up above the stop sign, right? And I absolutely love it. I just say, thank you. Because if I went and modified a sign, it's like they're modifying modern technology, right? And if I did that, I'd probably end up with a ticket or something, right? Like if
They're
I went
decolonizing.
yeah, like that's right. If I painted a tree on the stop sign, I'd be in trouble. But when the tree just makes the stop sign a tree, right? It's a totally different thing. But I just love those moments when I see that. It's the same thing as, Coyote on Rodeo Drive, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. It's a different kind of belonging. Or another kind of belonging, maybe.
It's so it's so powerful, right? Because it's like they don't need permission. They don't need permission to take over that car or to grow up around the stop sign. They just do, right? And because they just are. It's in their DNA. So whereas we, in the world we're in now, we need permission to do anything. Anything anything. And if we try, if we try to do something that is fundamentally in the interests of the earth, we often end up arrested. And I think of the Wet'suwet'en. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, of the land defenders taking on such a huge frontline responsibility on everyone's behalf, and the legislation against them. Yeah.
Well, and that's actually one of the essays that I do in the book, talks about the rule of law and how the rule of law is selective, right? And the Wet'suwet'en are my example, right? Because it was the Delgamuukw case where the highest court in the land said, that their title their sovereignty had not been extinguished. They had not relinquished their sovereignty, and their title and rights had not been extinguished. But as soon as they tried to exercise those rights and that title, then somehow the rule of law no longer applies. And and I raised the question about how can a Canadian legal institution rule against itself, rule against the foundations of its own institutions, right? It can't. And that's what systemic change means. It means rooting out all of that so that, when the rule of law says, yes, they are sovereign, yes, they have not relinquished their rights, then everything else needs to fall into place. It can't just be words, right? If it's just words, then why bother? Don't say them. And yeah, so and did you know that only 11% of the entire land base in Canada is privately owned? 11%.
And the rest of it is Crown.
Is either federal, it's almost half and half between federal and Crown land, or federal and provincial Crown land. And do you know where the term Crown land came from? It's so great. I'll start out by saying that one of the fundamental things in a democracy is that arbitrariness is considered entirely wrong. Laws will be overturned because they are arbitrary, and arrests, certain things will all be considered wrong if they are arbitrary. But when it comes to Crown land, where that came from was in the 1100s in Britain, where the King of England said only the king can own land. It was a decree, an arbitrary decree that only the king can own land. That's where the principle of Crown land came from. So how can we call ourselves a leading democratic nation when at the very foundation of our country and our laws and our institutions is a completely arbitrary law, right? And, so it's like, think about that, everybody. It's like,
it's so lazy.
Well, yeah, and just some crazy king that said, only I shall own the land, right? And where does that come from? The divine right of kings, right? When it was believed that, kings were, the left hand of God, right? And that's, really, that is the foundation of our society? Well, yes, it is.
Yeah, that hierarchical thinking is so damaging because it means sort of like the equivalent of when you talk to your parent or ask your parent for something and they say no, and you say, but why? And they, because I said so.
I said so.
Like it's just lazy. It's not skillful. It's not big thinking. It's not relational. Like, it's so problematic. And we have, that is what that's the foundation of colonialism.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Crown land.
I said so. Crown land. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Well, yeah,
doesn't make me dislike it anymore.
Or like it anymore. But, and it's when you take it even a step further, okay, that's why when there is, even with the Chilcotin and their decision where they were found to have title to their territories, it is still held that their title is a burden on the crown title, okay? And that's like having a lien against your house, okay? That it's the same thing. Your title is not absolute, okay? The government can come and take your house at any time, really, okay? And that's the same thing with Aboriginal title, is that it's still considered like a lien on the crown title. Crown still maintains the underlying title, okay? So is it title? If it's not title, what is it, right? It's still a conditional recognition because it's in that context of Crown land, of that arbitrary decree of who can and cannot own the land, right? So, not that we were ever thinking about owning land to begin with, right? But, no, we didn't own the land. I think about, in particular, potlatch people. Even with potlatch people, they didn't own the land. They owned the responsibility for identifiable pieces of land that coincided with names and, so on and so forth. But that wasn't owning the land itself. That was recognizing the responsibility to specific land, but with some very, very, very clear, well-established historical distinctions between, okay, Niska are responsible for this land and Tsimshian are responsible for this land, right? With the, the boundaries between nations and so on. But yeah, Yeah, it's all very interesting when you just have the opportunity, which I've had, and I'm thankful for, to just think about this stuff, right? Um, like with pretendians, okay? I did one of these essays is about pretendians, and I was just racking my brain about how can I explain this in a way that people will understand it, right? Because somebody said to me, and it was an Indigenous person, said to me, the word Indigenous is so ambiguous. And I said, it is not, right? You know, in fact, it's one of the few words that is absolutely not ambiguous in the English language. It just means a very specific thing. And so I was thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it. I was thinking about in Five Little Indians, where I used the analogy um, where George is telling Clara that she's not a weed, right? That she's an Indigenous flower, right? And so I think about that was one of those moments for me, right? And so I was thinking about that. I thought, okay, so what is an indigenous plant anyway, right? So, I Google around, Google around, Google around. And the Audubon Society has defined an indigenous plant, and we're talking about North America, okay, an indigenous plant that existed in North America prior to European colonization. That's an indigenous plant. Yeah, I thought, okay, so there's the analogy. That's what indigenous people are, the people that were here prior to colonization. Okay. So, but then they also have naturalized plants. Okay. And a naturalized plant is a plant that has, in effect, been adopted by the ecosystem, right? It was a plant that wasn't there before European colonization, but um, it hasn't taken over the environment. It has been welcomed by the indigenous ecosystem. Okay. And so the analogy that I draw there, those are the people that are adopted into community. Okay. Is that they're not indigenous, but they've been welcomed because they're not trying to destroy it. They fit in and they're welcomed and loved and cherished, but they're not indigenous, right? And then there is the invasive species, right? And the invasive species, and it's beautiful the way it's described as basically as an unwanted species that destroys everything, right? And that's the pretendian. Okay, so that's the analogy that I was able to draw to try and explain. So when somebody has chosen this fraudulent ethnic theft of pretendianism, they are in fact an invasive species. They are drawing all of the resources from indigenous people and taking everything that they possibly can at the expense of the indigenous plants and the naturalized plants, right? I thought maybe now people will understand it, right? I thought it was a pretty good analogy. I was just walking around my little house laughing my face off when I really, like when I read, that it's, what existed here, the plants that were here before European colonization. It's like, how clear, could you be more clear, right? Yeah. So.
Yeah, I'm pretty confounded by people when they somehow manage to be confused about pretendians, and I'm not sure how that's confusing at all. Like, it's very, very clear to me and to most of our people.
Yeah.
And yeah, I like your.
I don't think that people are confused. I don't think they're genuinely confused. I think that they're conflicted. Okay, and I think they're conflicted for all sorts of unfortunate reasons, mostly wrapping around influence, privilege, and money. When you have these pretendians that are that have leverage, okay, that can generate resources for people or organizations, I think people become conflicted, but they know. I mean, give me a break. They know. Yeah. They're not confused. They're just conflicted, which is different. They have conflicted loyalties. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important distinction. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like, much like all of our conversations, we could sit here for 100 years and there'd still be more to talk about. And I want to just say, before we sign off our virtual space conversation, that in diving into the waters of these conversations, part of what really excites me in speaking with you and in listening to you is that we get to go to very deep places. And I think where some people might find it scary or uncomfortable, it actually feels very joyous and hopeful
and fun.
And I just want to say I'm so glad to be here in conversation with you, and I'm so grateful for you and the way you walk in the world.
Well, thank you, Jada. And I just have to say, when my kid died, it was a turning point. I mean, I was already kind of that way anyway, right? Where there was sort of a natural disinclination to engage in bullshit. And, that I have always been looking for what's real, what is authentic, what is contributory and positive. But when Jay died, it was like, okay, that's it. I will never have a superficial conversation again in my life. I have no tolerance for wasting spirit, right? We are before anything else, we are spirit, and I don't want to waste that in things that don't generate something good, right? And it doesn't have to be complex or intellectual or any of those kinds of things, but just good, right? There has to be, and I just imagine if we all did that, if we were all dedicated to increasing the goodness quotient in the world, and we all could be, yeah. So I welcome these. Well, I just don't tolerate anything else but this. Really, I minimize my exposure to anything other than, this kind of exchange. And, and I mean, that means that my life is quite solitary in many ways, but I'm okay with that, right? Totally okay with it. Yeah. Save my resources for moments like these.
Yeah, I understand that. I appreciate that. And I really appreciate spending time together today. Thank you.
Me too. Thank you.
And I'll for sure read this book of essays.
Okay, yeah, it's called Truth Telling, 7 Conversations about Indigenous Reality in Canada.
When does it come out?
May 30th.
Okay.
I'll get you an ARC, though. I'll get you an advanced reading copy.
Ooh, I'd love that. That's exciting.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. Take really good, gentle care.
Thank you, my dears.
So that wraps up our 2-part conversation with Michelle Good. And please come back again and see us in our next episode, where we have a wonderful conversation in store with Jenna Brewer.